This is DJ.
And this is Ish.
And this is
Season
6 of Pero Let Me Tell You.
So, okay, if y'all have been listening to the show for any length of time, you know that I am a total comic book geek. And that encompasses all elements of it, whether it is, your single issues, your trade paperbacks, graphic novels, etc. And so when I stumbled upon a little book called Isla to Island by today's guest, Alexis Castellanos, I knew I had to have her on the show to chat about this fantastic book, talking about, one girl's experience as a Peter Pan. So thank you for joining us, Alexis.
Thank you for having me. It's so cool to hear someone say the title of my book and my name in like a Cuban accent. Other than my family, I think that's the first time I've heard it. I get a lot of Isla to Island. So that was a nice treat.
Well, then get ready for this. So Isla to Island tells the story of Marisol.
Here we go.
As she makes her way, again, as I mentioned, as a Peter Pan flight from Cuba to New York City. And I have to say, first preface this by saying my dad was one of the kids on a Peter Pan flight. So I can relate to this. His story was a lot different in that his dad was already here, but his mother was in Cuba, his father was here, so he was sent on this flight, by himself, and he went through all those emotions. Just like, okay, well, you're leaving this country. He was 11, I think, when he did so. So definitely around the age of Marisol. Obviously he's a boy, not a girl, but he came with his two sisters, if that helps. So what inspired you to craft this story? Because I do know that you said your parents were not Peter Pan; they came on the Freedom flights.
Yeah.
What was it about this story that or that angle that said this is the perfect venue to communicate through my art?
I have always been really interested in this part of like Cuban-American history. Operation Peter Pan has always fascinated me. So the whole book came to me very, very quickly. So it's difficult to pinpoint any one part thing, but it all came together because I walked into a bookstore in 2016, kind of looking for inspiration, and then looking at the shelves, there were like no Latin American books on the shelves really at that time, or not a lot. I think remembering the only book that was on their like bestsellers was Esperanza Rising, which came out in like 2001. So I was like, well, I need to do something about this. And like the questions I quickly started asking myself is like, okay, well, I want it to be a Cuban-American story because I'm Cuban-American. And I want it, it's summer 2016. There's a lot happening in this country at that time in regards to immigration at the border, in particular with children. So that was probably in the back of my mind as I was thinking about this. I was thinking, when most Americans think about Cuban history, they probably think of Bay of Pigs, Fidel Castro, Cuban Missile Crisis, and it ends there.
If they even think about that.
If even. So I wanted to cover something that's taking place around those events, so it's maybe more approachable in that way. And I also wanted to cover a topic that I felt was relevant to what was happening at the time and is still happening. But I feel like for some people, it's easier to approach these things through a historical lens,
right,
as opposed to being faced like with the issues head on, being able to have that distance and look at how it was done in the past or how things have changed may help someone's perspective in present day.
Yeah, it's more of a storytelling versus a lecture, at least perception wise.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's great. Now, one of the many things I love about your book is that there is, I think, maybe 6 words in the entire thing, and they may not even be spoken words, or it's like it's a silent movie essentially, as a graphic novel. That is so genius because I think in particular when you're telling a story like this that does appeal across cultures and across languages, by removing language, so to speak, and keeping it more to like visual cues, I think it just broadens the appeal a little more. You know, anybody can relate to it because now, you know, obviously Marisol being from Cuba, she speaks Spanish, but by not having Spanish be in it, now somebody doesn't look at it and say like, well, I don't read Spanish, I don't know what she's feeling, I don't know. No, you know, just by looking at it. Was that a very
Exactly.
was that a conscious decision from that angle, or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. From the inception, I knew this book didn't have words, because I especially at that time in 2016, I think a lot of people struggled and still to this day struggle with empathy, and having empathy for people that are different or have different experiences. So I decided not to have words in it because I wanted the book to kind of serve as this empathy building exercise, and I wanted the reader to go on a parallel journey to Marisol. Marisol can't communicate with the people around her. When she's with her foster parents, they don't share a language. When she's with her own parents in Cuba, her parents are shielding her from what's happening and not communicating with her.
Right.
So that's a parallel experience that the reader and Marisol get to have together, even though, you know, you can't read her internal thoughts and you can't understand what people are saying around her. You can share the experience with her.
Right.
But I think,
but I'm going to actually correct you. I think you can tell her thoughts by your art.
Yeah.
By the way, you know, her facial expressions, her moods, her actions, it goes a long way. And I think sometimes people get lost in the whole, oh, comics are for kids, or, you know, it's that whole thing of like show don't tell, right? If you are doing something visual, your art needs to communicate that, or else I can read a book, right? Like I don't need a visual that can only be understood if somebody throws in 65 captions. That's just kind of defeats the purpose of the medium, doesn't it?
Exactly. This is definitely, that was one of the most difficult parts of working on this book, is that the panels had to do all of the heavy lifting. I couldn't rely on any kind of narration or captions to ground the reader in the scene. It all had to be done visually, which was a challenge.
So, question. Are you a fan of The Wizard of Oz? Because I totally got the vibes where the book starts in... It does a little extra than Wizard of Oz, where it starts in color. When she gets to New York, it goes to black and white, and then it does shift to color at the end. And I immediately was like, oh, this is a fish out of water Wizard of Oz, template, or I'm trying to think of the right word that sounds like what I'm trying to say, but it's that it's what we understand, right? It's shorthand.
No, I definitely get it. I remember checking out The Wizard of Oz from Blockbuster like 6 times one summer, so it's definitely in the bank in my head. But yeah, I have a degree in theater, and
you did theater scenery, right, in New York?
Yeah, I was a scenic painter.
There you go. There's always a better term than what I'm saying. There's always a better way to say it.
If I say I was a scenic artist, people will not know what that is. I painted sets. That's what I did. They're like, "Oh, you were a set designer?" And I was like, "No, that involves so much math. I just painted sets." So I've just always been really intrigued by visual storytelling. And when you're getting your degree in theater, you cover design basics. So line, shape, color, and how you use these things can help to tell stories. So that it's just been in my toolbox.
Yeah, it's just something, a little back pocket you pulled out here and created this beautiful work of art in its own right. Were you a fan of comics growing up? Is that something that, or is this a situation where you had the story in your mind and this just kind of became the medium to tell it?
I was a huge fan of manga growing up. I read so much manga, like shoujo manga. I watched a lot of anime. I remember I would draw comics for my friends, little short comics, all throughout middle school. And then when high school hit, I got really into theater, and that kind of diverted almost all of my attention.
Okay.
I still read a lot of books, but I stopped reading comics as much once I went to high school and college, and then only in the past few years where I was got this idea, and I was like, I think this idea is a graphic novel. It's a comic book. I was like, I should get back into graphic novels. But it was something I loved. Like, I wanted to draw comics. Like, that was my dream when I was in middle school. And then I found a new dream. I was like, actually, no, I love theater. And then, I did that for a few years. And I was like, actually, no, I want to be an author. So here's to having lots of dreams.
Yeah, no, I can relate that. For up until about maybe freshman year of high school, I was convinced that I was going to draw comic books for a living. That's what I was going to do. So yeah, I can relate. And I also did theater in high school. So we're both Cuban-American, theater, comic books. I think we're a little kindred spirit
yeah, definitely.
situation here. So you grew up in Florida. Where specifically? What area? Was it down here, down south? South Florida, Miami?
I lived in Miami until I was 11,
Okay.
and then we moved up to Central Florida, and I was like in the Orlando area until I graduated from high school. I went to Tallahassee for a year, hated Tallahassee, ended back up in Orlando, and I went to UCF.
Oh,
so
okay.
I've kind of been around the world in Florida.
You did the Florida tour.
I did. Did not go to the Panhandle. Stayed away. Have to main drag.
There's no need for the Panhandle, to be honest with you.
No.
There's no need, as anybody who's from Florida will tell you. I wanted to read. Obviously, it's not a passage from the book per se, because as we just said, there's no words in the book. But I wanted to read a part of your author's note, which I keep going over and over, and I think has really resonated with me. You say, "I wasn't raised on stories of mythical creatures or princesses and towers. I was raised on the stories of my family, their lives in Cuba, and later, the lives they made for themselves in the United States." When I read that sentence, I thought to myself, that is so universal for us as Cuban Americans that I want to think it's universal for everybody, but I do know what it is for us to grow up always hearing about, como era en Cuba. Like, esto era mejor en Cuba, or yo en Cuba era, and not just with our own families, right? It just seems like that's the world that kind of circled around us. That, it was this always constant reminder of, like, we had to leave our galaxy and come here where everything is so different. It's like, well, you breathe oxygen, it can't be that different. But there's, was that your? I mean, obviously that was your experience as well. How do you feel like that has shaped you as a creative? Because I could point to the book obviously and say, well, here's the example, but this book, I feel like maybe this book is just the current iteration of that storytelling, of that historical narrative that lives inside all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so inspired by my family at every turn. Not only for the sacrifices and journeys they made so that I could be where I am today, but because they're wild.
We are good storytellers. We are as a culture. We're great storytellers.
The stories I've heard are just absolutely wild, what my family was up to. So yeah, I mean, every little bit that they shared with me is sprinkled throughout my works. Like, so much of Isla to Island is pulled from stories that my mom told me or that my grandparents told me. Mm-hmm. And even though, like, my future books aren't so closely tied to my personal family history, the fact that I hold that so dear, I think, is in my work. And also, it makes me like a really nostalgic person. Like, I'm a sucker for nostalgia. I think that's what it made me as an adult become, as someone who just, like, loves nostalgia, because I just loved hearing those stories growing up.
But yeah, those stories become just part of you, right? They're not just like, oh yeah, I heard that story. Oh, sometimes you almost feel like you were there in a weird way, because you've heard it so many times, but you've also heard it from several different people. So you've had the benefit of hearing almost like the same story with little tweaks, which lets you be like, maybe that's not exactly how it happened when I hear it from Abuela, because I've heard it from her brother and it sounds slightly different. So it makes it a little bit more interesting, and considering we can't exactly go back there and find out, firsthand. It gives it a little bit more of a 360 appeal to it.
And I do feel like it's something very specific to Miami Cubans in particular, because there's something about Miami Cubans that will not let go of Cuba and the dream and the hope. Because I have family that stayed in Queens. Like, my family initially came to Queens and then went down to Miami. But the family that stayed in Queens, like they're Cuban, everything's Cuban, but that sense of like we're gonna go back, or there's that hope to go back,
The
or
longing.
we need to, the longing isn't there as much. And so I thought that was really interesting when I moved up to New York and I spent more time with that family, that wasn't there. And with my family, that was like this ever present thing, this longing that did not go away. Is it Molinas, where they have like all those posters of like Cuba, like today, if Castro didn't happen? It's just like this dream, this fantasy that exists in Miami that is so specific to that location in particular, because I've gone elsewhere and Cubans aren't like that there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting dichotomy, because as much as Cubans who are here for, and I can't speak for all of them obviously, but for the most part are very, glad to be here and very grateful of opportunities, and because they will tell you themselves. I'm not speaking for them. They will be the first ones to say, this country has given me everything, etc. It's weird that they do still hold on to that. But what if? And maybe there is a little bit more universality to that in terms of, first generation wave immigrants that arrived.
Yeah.
But we're talking now 60 some odd years down the line, right? And it's still there. But it's so true what you say, because I've met Cubans all over the country, and there are pockets here and there, but I feel like West Coast Cubans are different than East Coast Cubans. And when I say East Coast Cubans, I'm talking like Jersey, New York, than Miami Cubans. And I don't know if it's just because Miami became that Cuba the sequel hub, but it seems like, even here, 2-3 generations in, there's people now who've never been to Cuba, who've never lived there, who don't know that experience firsthand, and are longing for a country that just doesn't exist.
Yeah, that it doesn't exist. It makes me so sad to think about it, and to think about my abuelos, that like they gave that to me. They gave me this fantasy of a country that I will never get to see, a country that's like frozen in time.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Have you ever been?
There's a longing. I've never been. I was planning to go with my mom. Since my mom was born there, she has to go through that whole like all the hoops, and then the passport expired, and there was a fee, and then the pandemic happened. Yeah. And then the pandemic happened, and we just keep pushing it back. She wants to go back to do a kind of like ceremony for her mom, to put her to rest there. So it's like, it's on the calendar, but my mom's never gone back. My stepdad did go back for dental surgery.
Oh, that's an interesting reason to go back.
Yeah, it was just after Obama had like loosened a lot of the restrictions, and he's afraid of the dentist, so he went after years, and they're like, your mouth is rotten, it's going to cost you thousands of dollars. And he was like, you know what? I'm going to go visit my cousin in Cuba. But he had to do it over 3 trips, so he would come home and he'd be missing all of his teeth.
Oh, yeah, no, that's not good.
And then he'd have to go back to get the implants or whatever. So he was going back and forth. He went to where the old family farm used to be, that my family still has the deed for.
Are you serious?
Waiting for the day. Yes.
Oh, wow.
My grandfather held on to the original deed for La Finca, but it's all gone now. Like it's just land. They knocked down the house. But I remember my mom used to tell me that on that property, she would go like playing around, and there were caves, and there were cave paintings on the property. So I mean, I would have to like jump a fence to go find that, but there's so much I want to see.
No, I can imagine. What part of the island are they from?
Havana.
La Habana. Okay. Yeah, just because you mentioned the finca, so I was thinking they might be off.
Yeah. No, it was the weekend finca, I guess.
Oh, okay.
I know they had a house in Havana, and then they had where they just rode horses or something.
Yeah, as one did back then.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, you did it in passing, and you probably thought I wasn't going to notice, but I did. You mentioned future books.
Yes.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't pick up on that and ask, what's next? What's on the agenda? Because as much as I love Isla Island, and it will probably become very, very worn as I look it over many times, now I'm spoiled. I want more from you.
I don't know if I have another graphic novel in me. It was so hard. I'm still recovering. I finished drawing it August 2021. And I feel like I'm just finally coming out of the fog of working on this book. So maybe one day another graphic novel, but until then I'm going to stick to prose. Like the next book is going to be all words, no pictures.
The other side of the pendulum.
Yeah. Nothing's announced yet, but I do have I have some fun stuff I'm working on. Nothing definitely stuff that's more lighthearted. After working on Isla, it was at time, I don't want to say traumatic, but very emotionally draining. Because I remember I would work on this book and then I'd call my mom and, I'd ask her some questions and I'd talk to her about some stuff. And then she would just unload a story on me that I'd never heard before. That would be, inevitably like heartbreaking. Because I guess now that I'm older, growing up, I got all the fun stories.
Right. The PG version.
Yeah, the funny ones. Even if they were sad, like when they moved to Queens, there was no heat in the apartment and it was the middle of winter and they didn't have winter clothes. So they went to the Salvation Army and my grandfather got a coat. And when they're having guests over, he said, don't take off your coats. We don't have heat. But look, I have this coat. Mine has blood on it. And there's like blood stains in his Salvation Army coat.
Jeez.
So not a lighthearted story, but still like, funny.
That was a coat that came from the Hudson River.
Yeah. But I got to hear, the stuff that doesn't have a funny punchline at the end. So physically, the book was draining. Emotionally, the book was draining. So I'm glad that like almost every reader that comes up to me tells me they cried. I was like, you better cry. I deserve those tears.
I want that to be the pull quote on the jacket, by the way, of the book. It's like, Alexis Castellanos says, you better cry when you read this book.
You better cry. I had to do this like kind of like a speed dating thing with booksellers. And like one author had a PowerPoint presentation and I was like, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. And I sat there and I was like, I got 4-star reviews and everyone that's read it told me they cried. So if you want to cry, I left that. I was like, is that really the elevator pitch for my book? Operation Peter Pan and crying.
Hey, whatever gets the book sold. Okay. And never underestimate the power of catharsis.
There you go.
Yeah. No, I discovered your book because it was on Newsrama's top 10 for 2022.
Oh yeah.
And I've seen your book on several, must reads and you've made a lot of lists. And so very well deserved. Very well deserved. And, listeners, if you have a chance, if you're perusing, if you're looking for something that is all ages in the best way possible, because I think a lot of times you hear all ages and people think it's for children, but this really means all ages. Like this is something that everyone can appreciate. Please, please, please. I can't stress enough. Isla to Island, it's a quick read, but it's a powerful read. And Alexis, thank you again so much for not just being on the show, but for creating this beautiful, beautiful book. And I can't wait to see what the next one is. Now I'll get to read as opposed to look at drawings and you'll come back on to talk about that one, and then you'll talk about the next one where you'll finally marry the two. I feel this is going to be your trilogy, right? Like the first one was just all pictures. The second one's going to be all words. The third one's going to be both.
Oh yeah, I'm planning. That's the trajectory I'm looking for.
I think it's fantastic, and best of luck with just all of your future projects, because you're definitely a hell of a talented lady.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. This is a great chat.
Pero Let Me Tell You is co-hosted by Darian Borges and Ismaeliano, produced by Ismaeliano, and our theme, Pero Let Me Tell You Freestyle, is composed by Michael Angelo Lomlaplex, the official gay guy. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes.